When I was 16, I wanted to date this guy named TJ. The only problem was that while I lived in Canada, my Indian parents were actually really, really strict. So I had to ask my dad's permission to go out with him. And this is exactly what my dad said to me. He said, Michelle, holding hands leads to kissing. And kissing, well, that leads to pregnancy. So, yeah, you can tell where that went. You might think that this piece of information or the answer came from someone who wasn't educated. But actually, my dad was really educated. He was an engineer, and my mom was a doctor. The only thing was that my family wasn't educated in how to deal with feelings. Feelings that were confusing, awkward, and pleasurable. Pretty much everything that my dad missed out in his answer that he gave to me. So, getting this information is hard for everybody. I don't want to downplay that. But imagine if you live in places like in the world like the Middle East, Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Chances are, in many of these countries, you may not be able to decide when to have sex, or who you want to date, or actually get married to, or how many children you'd like to have. Chances are, you live in a country that censors information on sexual health and sexuality. I think that's a real shame. And the reason why I think it's a real shame is that sex can be really pleasurable in your life. And I actually believe that it should be a fundamental human right to have pleasurable sex and safe and satisfying relationships. So, yet, I want to say that more people get information like that. Masturbation causes blindness. Loose women have clitorises. Or all gay people are pedophiles. No. And only sluts get abortions. Kind of a bummer. So in a past life, I actually wanted to be a doctor. And I did HIV/AIDS research in Namibia, Kenya, and India. And at the time, there was actually a lot of information on how to prevent HIV infection. And the hope was that just getting this information alone would motivate you and make you want to change your behavior. But the reality was that it was missing something very vital. It was missing information on pleasure and also how to avoid infection. In a nutshell, how to make safe sex sexy. So I thought that this was a simple oversight. I was in my early 20s, and I thought, okay, well, maybe if I get a master's and have more real-world experience, that this was just an oversight. But I found out actually it wasn't. I went to school here, actually in Amsterdam. I went to school at KIT, the Public School of Health. And what I found out is that no matter how much you study the ins and outs of sex, death, and disease, and that's partially what you do when you study epidemiology, you don't get love, life, or happiness. I don't know why, but you just don't. And what I found out was that we're focusing on the wrong things. Or I felt the things that we were focusing on were how to avoid things, as opposed to things that you actually wanted in your life. And one of those things I wanted in my life was pleasure. So fast forward to a few years later, I worked together with a small team at the Dutch World Service, or the Wildomroep. And we decided to create a series of sexual health sites. And these were online platforms that talked about love, sex, and relationships for 18 to 30-year-olds in Mexico, Venezuela, Kenya, Egypt, India, and China. And we chose these countries because of legal restrictions. There were legal restrictions to getting access to information on sex and sexuality. And we also decided to put this information online so it could do two things. One, we could bypass traditional gatekeepers, like governments, parents, as well as religious groups. And the other thing we wanted to do is actually capitalize on the tremendous growth of internet access, specifically mobile internet. And these two things together meant that as long as you had access to internet, you could access our sites anonymously, privately, and most importantly, whenever you wanted. And I want to show you one of our sites. This is actually our Love Matters Kenya site. And what you'll notice is that we have basic information about his and her body, as well as information on birth control and sexually transmitted diseases. But we haven't forgotten the pleasure side. So you'll notice that we have information on how to make love and love and relationships. Since our sites are for young people, we wanted to make sure that the content is actually also made by young people. So we have bloggers and first-person testimonials, and this is an example of one such blog. I don't know if you can read it. I hope so. So, how do you talk about pleasure when you don't know your own body? People often joke that men don't know where the clitoris is. In Egypt, young women don't even know the word clitoris exists, let alone where it is on their body. So how do you talk about pleasure when you don't have this basic information? Well, we started like this. It's a vulva, and it's in Arabic. It may not be revolutionary to you, but what's incredible is that a vulva and Arabic together is revolutionary to our audience. And that really matters, because often in the Middle East, you don't actually get to see women's bodies as well as explanatories in their own language. So how do you talk about pleasure when the language you speak doesn't have the words for it? And I want to give you an example. In Hindi, there's a word for masturbation. And masturbation in Hindi only means male masturbation, not female masturbation. So how do Indian women describe self-pleasure? Or what happens if they think only a man can do it? It is kind of a real shame if that's the case. So we wanted to make sure that it would be possible to talk about masturbation. So what we did was we added the word female, and it became female masturbation. This might seem like a really simple solution, but for whatever the reasons are, you don't usually see these combination of words together. And what's more important is that you can make simple adjustments to language and offer more people pleasure in their lives. We're actually one of the first organizations to rework terms like these and put them online. What happens if your language has a gender bias? And I want to show you an example of this advice given to this young couple. And the direct translation from Arabic to English reads like this. When you want to have sex, you may start by exploring what gives you pleasure. And that seems like this awesome piece of advice. Everyone should have that. Something that you would access in like a lifestyle magazine. What you don't realize is that this advice is only geared to one person in the relationship, the man. And the reason for that is that in Arabic, the most commonly used form of you is the masculine form. So what that means is a lot of sentences are just directed to one person, and it's just assumed that that male direction would encompass both female. But if you read the same sentence with this piece of information, what it tells you as a woman, imagine if you were reading this, you know, and it says like, when you want to have sex, you may start by exploring what gives you pleasure. As a woman, it could tell you that he is the subject, you are the object. And what it also can say to you is that your needs will only be met if his are, and if he finds pleasure in that. And if you're a man, it's a completely different sentence to you. It gives you ownership over your pleasure. It gives you power. It also tells you that you have needs and they can be met. So we took this sentence and translated it into something longer. And the good thing is we also added the female perspective. So you got both people in that same relationship getting advice and that it speaks to them. And by doing this, you can give pleasure to both people. Sometimes it doesn't take that much to actually include pleasure in our audience's life. You don't need to invent new words or change the gender dynamic in a language. Sometimes all it takes is actually using some creative visuals. In many of the countries that we work, it's difficult to get positive images of real people, real body types, and diverse skin tones. Young Mexicans and Venezuelans are more likely to see images of beauty queens. Young Kenyans are more likely to see images online of them as tribal people, which they're, not necessarily. And young Indians are more likely to see fair-skinned Bollywood types. And yes, these images are beautiful, but the problem is if all you see is this, imagine what that says to you. It tells you that for you to be happy or healthy or worthy of love, you've got to be perfect. You've got to have, you could be exoticized, or you've got to be white to be acceptable. And for the average person living in those countries, it basically tells you that you're just not good enough. And so what we did was we decided to do real photo shoots with real people, real body types, and a diverse range of skin tones. So you must be wondering by now if this whole pleasure thing really works. And well, to date we've had over 9.4 million visits to our sites. And by and large, people come for information on pleasure. So something really special happens when you use pleasure to talk about sex and sexuality. What ends up happening is that people who normally don't join in on discussions start coming in. You also get people who would never dare to ask a question start asking them. In particular, in India, we have more men coming to our sites than women. And given the high-profile rape crisis cases, I think that's a really important step to include men in the discussion. So what do you think men ask? Well, they ask a question like this. Yes, they do. They do. They do. They ask a question like this, even more. So take a look. Yeah. So that's important to know, right? Talking about pleasure allows you to talk not only about the fluffy stuff, but address really important questions and painful myths. Talking about pleasure allows you to talk about boundaries as well. It allows you to say, if you want to talk about saying yes to pleasure, you got to be able to say no to pain. And we also get questions like this. Just so you know, we're an adult site, so to put it into context, what these questions are actually from our audience. They don't happen very often, but they do. They do tell you that you're hitting the right nerve. And for me, when I read these questions, what it tells me is that young people don't see themselves as perpetrators of sexual violence or human rights abusers. They see themselves as people in need of some information. They're at a crossroads. And I actually believe that the difference between violating someone's rights and making an informed decision is information. Because I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but sexual violence happens on the everyday, mundane level. It happens in, normal everyday relationships. It could happen to you, it could happen to I. They're often in intimate relationships. So it's all the more important to offer information, a safe space, and using entry points. And pleasure is one of the ways that you get people to talk about these difficult issues. So young people deserve better advice than I got at the start. And at the same time, they also deserve information that includes sexual pleasure as well as basic sex ed. We've reached 9.4 million visits, and we would like to reach millions more, actually, so that love and sex can fulfill their potential not for misery, but for pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.